Ugarit, come in peace. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 238, Merneptah seizes Canaan. In 1225 BCE, around November, Egypt's Valley of the Kings bustled with activity. Porters and priests gathered up their tools, while labourers shoveled basket-loads of sand and rubble into a pit. The funeral of Ramesses II was ending, and they were burying his tomb. Nearby, a chariot stood waiting, perhaps fitted with a parasol umbrella. In the cart stood a man clad in the finest linen robes, and a crown glittering with gold. He was tall for the era, about 1.7 meters, or 5'6". He was balding, and possibly quite slender. The man's name was Merneptah, beloved of Ptah, the new king of Egypt. Merenptah was the 13th son of Ramesses II, the eldest survivor of the great pharaoh's brood. He had come to prominence about 12 years earlier. For over a decade, Merenptah had served as a top-ranking army commander, a representative of the king, and a leader of political officers. Now, at last, he was pharaoh. By the time he inherited power, Merenptah was in his mid-40s or so, an elder statesman by ancient standards, and he already suffered physical ailments. The king's body survives today, and studies show that he had poor dental health, degeneration in his bones, like arthritis, and atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. Like his father before him, Merenptah would have suffered tooth pain, stiffness in the limbs, and poor blood flow to the extremities. Coming to power in the early winter, his visit to the Valley of the Kings may have been discomforting. Whatever his age, though, Merenptah would be an active king. His time in power was remarkably eventful, and in hindsight, Merenptah's reign is the pivot point of the 19th Pharaonic dynasty. Decisions made in this era, and challenges faced, would have long-lasting effects on the royal house and wider Egyptian society. It began with a name. As pharaoh, Merenptah called himself Ba-ni-Ra, meaning the ram or soul of Ra. This was quite unusual. We don't often see rulers calling themselves the Ba of anything. It also broke a pattern that had been forming under his predecessors. 80 years earlier, Ramesses I had called himself Menpechti Ra, or Ra's strength is established. Seti I elaborated on that and called himself Men-Ma'at Ra, Ra's order is established. Ramesses II carried on the pattern and became Usir Ma'at Ra, Ra's order is mighty. It was a developing trend, but a trend nonetheless. Merenptah discarded that and became Ba-ni-Ra. Why? According to Kenneth Kitchen, one of the preeminent scholars of this era, Merenptah's royal names reveal something of his political personality, and maybe even his emotional state. In 1987, Kitchen studied the names of all the Ramesside rulers, and he described Merenptah as follows. Quote, Merenptah had a problem. How does one follow a king like Ramesses II without being overshadowed by him? His solution was to express the same basic ideals, but as differently as possible from his formidable father. End quote. That is going to be a common theme for this ruler. Beginning in his father's shadow, Merenptah strove to build on what had come before, while making his own mark on the royal identity. So the kingly name, Ba-ni-Ra, was something new. The personal name we've already seen, Merenptah, beloved of Ptah. To this, he added the epithet Chetep Cher Ma'at, or one who is satisfied with order. So he was beloved of Ptah, contented with Ma'at. A nice, pious name. Today, you'll often find the king described as Merneptah or Merenptah, both of which are perfectly valid and functional. For the ancients, though, it was probably pronounced something like Ma-ni-Ptah Chatpamua. We learn that from letters received from rulers in Syria, which I'll explain shortly. So, Merneptah, Merenptah, Ma-ni-Ptah, take your pick. The rest of the royal names were equally grandiose. but they carry important messages about the pharaoh's intent. As a Horus, god of kingship, Merneptah called himself Ka Nacht Chai Em Ma'at, the victorious bull who rejoices in Ma'at. Classic stuff. The king intended to uphold the established order. Then, suddenly, things get aggressive. For the two ladies' name, invoking goddesses of north and south, Merenptah was the Ir Bau Erta en Chemechu, the one who has exercised power against the land of the Chemechu. This name referenced war against the peoples of Libya to the west. Unusually specific, but there it is. Finally, as the Golden Horus, or Golden Falcon, Merneptah was Neb Senej A'a Shefit, the Lord of Terror, Great of Dread. Apparently, the new king wanted to inspire awe and fear in those who beheld him, the sort of leader happy to wield their authority. Merneptah's royal names give a sense of his public personality, and perhaps a hint at his priorities. First and foremost, Merneptah struck a belligerent tone. There's a strong militaristic bent to his titles, conveying a sense of terror and overbearing might. Merneptah made warfare a central part of his public persona. And that wasn't a boast. He followed through on it repeatedly. The first war occurred in the north when Merneptah sent an army to Canaan. Marching on behalf of the pharaoh, Egyptian troops crossed the Sinai Peninsula and entered the southern Levant. There, they attacked 3 major cities, defeated their troops, and then occupied them. Finally, they turned their weapons against nomadic tribes moving through the region. We learn all of this from a series of wall carvings at Karnak Temple and a grand stela erected in the King's Memorial Temple. Thanks to these records, historians have a rough outline of Merneptah's Canaanite campaign, and the unusual enemies he mentions. The stela is quite famous among ancient historians. It goes by 2 names, either the Victory Stela of Merneptah, self-explanatory, or the Israel Stela. You'll see why. Commissioned late in his reign and looking back on past events, the stela gives a long poetic description of Merneptah's victories. We hear about foreigners like Nubians and Libyans, and we'll talk about them in the future. Right at the end, the king discusses Canaan. He says, quote, "All of the great ones, or rulers, are prostrate, saying, 'Peace.' Hatti is at peace. Canaan is seized by every evil. Ashkelon is taken away. Gezer is captured. Yenoam is made as though it never existed. The Israel tribe is desolated, lacking its seed. Syria appears as a widow because of Tameri, or Egypt." End quote. A couple of fun references here. Firstly, when Merneptah says, "All of the rulers are prostrate, saying, 'Peace,' the word he uses for peace is sharma, which might be the ancient equivalent of salam or shalom. Secondly, this speech might be familiar to you if you're a fan of the comic book Watchmen. On page 402 of that book, one of the major characters recites Merneptah's speech in reference to a major plot point. I'll try not to give spoilers for a 40-year-old comic, but it's there if you want to find it. Anyway, there's a lot of rhetoric there, but a few details give us the picture. It seems that Pharaoh's army entered Canaan from the south, then marched north and east. Following the coastal road, they attacked the great city of Ashkelon, or Iskarni. Previously, this town had been a semi-independent city-state, part of the Egyptian Empire, but free to manage its own affairs, as long as it gave tribute and loyalty. Now, Merneptah's army conquered and occupied it. Next, the troops turned northeast, marching into the highlands between the coast and Dead Sea. There, they attacked a town called Gezer, or Qajar. This was a strong town, built atop a hill with thick walls and powerful gates. Nonetheless, the Egyptian army broke down the door, scaled the walls, and overwhelmed the defenders. They seized Gezer. With that done, the troops of Pharaoh turned north, towards the Jezreel Valley. There, just south of the Sea of Galilee, was a town called Yenoam. It had been troublesome in the past. Seti I had faced the Yenoamites in battle and subdued them. Now, Merneptah's army did the same. Finally, the pharaoh's troops marched against a nomadic tribe called Issyria or Issyrial, which scholars tend to agree is an early form of the name Israel. Apparently, Merneptah defeated this tribe harshly. Pharaoh says that after his troops attacked, the tribe was now without its seed. Biblical scholars have speculated that this is a metaphor for destroying future generations, seed meaning progeny. However, Egyptian texts don't use that word in that manner. The pharaoh probably meant it literally. His army defeated the Israel tribe and stole all their food. Ouch. Notably, Merneptah's victory stela is the earliest known reference to a tribe called Israel, and the interpretations of this text, especially regarding the Bible, are an interesting discussion. I'll explore it more fully in the epilogue. For now, let's stay with Merneptah. The victory stela describes the itinerary. At Karnak, Merneptah's wall reliefs lay out the artistic vision. You can find these scenes directly south of the Great Hypostyle Hall, right next to Ramesses II's Hittite treaty. Across a series of vignettes, Merneptah rides his chariot against enemies and assaults the three major towns. He takes prisoners from the local Canaanites and the nomadic Shasu, or Bedouin. The king binds them up and brings them back to Egypt. It's classic stuff, the sort of art you would find on many of Ramesses II's temples. Ironically, Merneptah actually erased some of his father's art in order to put these murals here. Kind of strange, but there it is. As for the archaeology, there are some hints of Merneptah's Canaanite war. The city of Ashkelon, for example, was partially burned around this time, which might be the result of the attack. It also has a new fortress built in the Ramesside era, with mud brick walls and Egyptian-style pottery. The site of Ashkelon is only partly excavated, there's a modern city on top, so we don't know how badly the town was damaged. But Merneptah's troops may have torn down at least one section and built a fortress to guard it. The second target, Gezer, also has a destruction layer dating to the late 13th century. One of the elite buildings was burned to the ground, and the collapsing structure killed and buried a couple of people. Again, it's unclear if that was the work of Merneptah's troops. It could be an accidental fire and destruction. But the stratigraphy lines up with this period, so it's entirely possible that the Egyptian army burned part of Gezer. As for Yenoam, well, we're not sure. The town is probably in the Galilee region, based on historical references, but the archaeological site is not yet identified. At any rate, the fragmentary archaeological information suggests that Merneptah was not entirely destroying these communities. Instead, the Egyptian troops may have torn down part of them, like elite residences and gateways, and then occupied the city in force. It's not much to go on, but there are possible traces. You may be wondering, why was he doing this? Wasn't Canaan pacified, part of the Egyptian empire? What reason was there for a war? As far as the victory stela goes, we don't get an explanation, but there are a couple of possibilities. It may have been a rebellion. Scholars like Kenneth Kitchen and Frederick Servajean argue that Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam may have launched a coordinated uprising. Pierre Grandet recently described this as, quote, a revolt of unprecedented extent and gravity, with Merneptah's army going forth in a, quote, war of repression. This rebellion angle is plausible. The early years of any reign were a good time for testing the limits. It's certainly possible that three mighty cities tried to throw off Egyptian rule. If there was a rebellion, that might explain the next step in the archaeological story. You see, starting in the 19th dynasty, the Egyptian pharaohs began to tighten their grip on Canaan. Across the region, between the coast and the Dead Sea, archaeology reveals a sharp increase in Egyptian settlement and occupation. New fortresses were raised, with garrisons at strategic locations. Excavators have uncovered a dozen of these at sites like Gaza, Deir el-Balah, Tel Serah, Afek, and more. The forts are usually built on hills, or tells, commanding strategic roads and valleys. and they're evenly spaced, about 25 kilometers or 15 miles apart, which soldiers could cover in a day. From the sites themselves, excavators have uncovered pottery, buildings, food, and equipment, all dating to the 19th dynasty. This was a massive change from the 18th dynasty that came before. Back then, rulers like Thutmose and Amenhotep had allowed the locals to manage their own affairs. They demanded tribute and reinforcements when marching to war, but overall, the 18th dynasty empire was a light hand. By contrast, the 19th was more like an occupation. So, what changed? Merneptah himself described Canaan as, quote, seized by every evil. That could be a rebellion, or it could be something larger. Though he didn't know it, Pharaoh's campaign took place in the early stages of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Starting in the mid-13th century and lasting approximately 200 years, multiple communities in the eastern Mediterranean suffered catastrophic upheavals. Drought ravaged farmland and caused food shortages, even famine. Earthquakes destroyed or severely damaged cities. Raiding parties and invaders brought destruction to prominent communities. And within Canaan especially, the migrating sea peoples, in their separate tribes, settled in different regions, including towns like Ashkelon. That is still a few decades in the future, but if we step back from Merneptah and look at the grand sweep of history, his campaign fits in the larger context of disorder and change. The evils that Pharaoh referenced could very well be the early stages of the collapse. Bringing all this together, Merneptah sent his army north into Canaan. They attacked and conquered 3 major towns and defeated a tribe called Israel somewhere in the region. Around the same time, Egyptians were building forts across southern Canaan at strategic locations. Notably, these efforts were concentrated much further south than previous generations. Seti I and Ramesses II had marched far and wide, deep into modern Syria. But Merneptah focused on the regions south of Galilee. He still had business in Syria, as we'll see in a moment, but overall, his reign seems to be consolidation rather than expansion. Perhaps that was just good strategy. If the outside world was becoming unstable, then it was good to fortify the borders. He who defends everything defends nothing. And those strongholds in southern Canaan provided a bulwark against any enemy trying to approach the Nile. This is the kind of picture that could change drastically with future excavations. On current evidence, though, it seems like Merneptah's empire had shrunk. These were evil days indeed. Merneptah did not have the military reach of his father or grandfather, but there are other ways to expand an empire, and early in his reign, the new king achieved something that had eluded even Ramesses and Seti. It concerned Syria and the Hittites. From the start of his reign, the new pharaoh continued one of Ramesses II's famous policies. Egyptian ships sailed forth from the Nile Valley and went all the way to Hatti to deliver grain for the Hittite kings. Merneptah boasted of this on one of his monuments, saying, quote, "It is in order to make this Hatti land live that I have caused grain to be sent in ships." End quote. That might just be rhetoric, but food shortages were afflicting Hatti and Syria, and we've encountered some of them already in episode 233. Apparently, Merneptah continued the policy. However, while supporting his northern ally, the new pharaoh was not averse to some additional plotting. In fact, early in his reign, Merneptah took the opportunity to befriend one of Hatti's own vassals. On the west coast of Syria, a city called Ugarit has a long history. Strategically located where the trade routes from Cyprus meet those of Mesopotamia, Ugarit had prospered with international exchange. For a while, it had been under Egyptian influence, but in the late 13th century, the rising Hittite Empire had made Ugarit their vassal. Now, 100 years later, Hatti's power was waning. Their heartland suffered drought. Famine stalked their cities. Enemies pressed against their frontiers. And the great king of Hatti even suffered a crushing defeat against the Assyrians in Mesopotamia. We actually hear about this from Ugarit itself. Shortly after his victory, the Assyrian monarch sent a letter which reported on events. It said, quote, "I called my camp herald and said to him, 'Put on your armor and mount your chariots. The king of Hatti arrives in battle order.' I harnessed my chariot and made a charge, shouting, 'The king of Hatti comes ready to do battle!' Truthfully, I won a great victory." End quote. Defeat in Mesopotamia, drought and hunger at home. Clearly, the Hittite kings could no longer guard Syria properly, and the people of Ugarit knew that. Unfortunately, such political uncertainty arrived at a time of trouble for the city itself. Around 1250 BCE, approximately, Ugarit suffered a devastating earthquake. The city was not destroyed, merely damaged, but the tremor took its toll on the settlement. Notably, Ugarit's great temple, dedicated to Baal, was badly damaged by the quake. In the time of Merneptah, they were still repairing the sanctuary. With Hatti declining, and of no help at all, the local ruler did the best he could. He turned to Merenptah. Clay tablets found in the ruins of Ugarit record letters between their city and the Egyptian court. These messages come from Merneptah himself, and they reveal the city's difficulties. Quote, "You, the king of Ugarit, had written to me, Merneptah, saying, 'In the land of Ugarit there is severe hunger. May my lord save our land, and may the king give grain to save my life, and to save the people of the land of Ugarit.'" End quote. Apparently, Merneptah delivered on this request, sending a cargo of 7,000 dried fish, along with textiles and gold. You can't eat the fabric or metal, but at least they could trade it, and perhaps relieve their problems. On another occasion, the king of Ugarit requested help in rebuilding the temple of Baal. He asked that Merneptah, quote, "Grant that a sculptor be sent, and that he come to me to make an image of Merenptah Hatpamua in the temple that I am currently building for Baal of Ugarit." End quote. This letter gives us the foreign pronunciation of Merneptah's name, Merenptah Hatpamua, or Merenptah contented with Ma'at. Presumably, the cult statues and shrines of Baal had suffered damage in the earthquake. Now, the Syrian ruler wanted an Egyptian artist to help make new statues. Why he didn't just ask for the statues themselves, we don't know. The king's phrasing is interesting, though, because he asks for a statue to go opposite one that already existed, and which, quote, he, the pharaoh, has placed in the temple. That suggests that Merneptah had already sent a statue of Baal himself for the sanctuary in Ugarit. That statue has not survived, as far as anyone knows, but you can imagine it was lovely. Anyway, Merneptah denied this request for an artist. He claimed that his sculptors were, quote, engaged in fulfilling their duty for the great gods of Egypt. Fair enough, Merneptah was building a lot of monuments in his kingdom, but Pharaoh did promise that when they were done, he would send some artisans to Ugarit. In the meantime, Merneptah delivered more supplies, including ropes, about 600 meters worth, a large quantity of ebony wood, 1,000 plaques or tiles made of colored stone, the sort of things you would need for building a lavish temple complex. Pharaoh sent them all, delivered by a royal official named Amaya, and a fleet of, quote, ships of the treasury. All of this aid speaks to something significant. At this point, the great king of Hatti was no longer Ugarit's benefactor. The pharaoh of Egypt was. And the Ugarites were happy, if possible, to set up a statue of Merneptah in their own temple of Baal. Such an image at the sacred heart of the city would send a pretty clear message. Ugarit was returning to the Egyptian empire. Merneptah had declined the request initially, perhaps out of diplomatic politeness, but he still sent the supplies. And who knows, maybe the Egyptian sculptors did eventually make their way to Ugarit. However you look at it, it seems that Pharaoh had scored a diplomatic victory. Ugarit was once more a vassal. Merneptah's army cut a victorious swathe through Canaan. The annexation of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam plugged 3 gaps in the imperial frontier, and the defeat of the Israel tribe removed a nomadic threat. Meanwhile, soldiers and builders were hard at work on new fortifications, strengthening their control of the highlands. The policy brought security, but at a cost. The empire had contracted, and Merneptah's military reach was less than his father's. Further afield, there was some good news. Khati was at peace and still reliant on Egyptian grain. More notably, the wealthy city of Ugarit had broken with its old masters and returned to Egyptian friendship. On balance, things were still looking good. Southern Canaan was secure, and the return of Ugarit was a massive win. As the first few years came to a close, Merneptah could satisfy himself with a job well done. Unfortunately, the good times were short-lived. As the expedition army returned from Canaan, news arrived in Pharaoh's palace. To the west, tribes in Libya had gathered in a coalition, along with some strange peoples of the sea. They were on the move, heading towards the Nile Valley, and they came armed. Egypt was being invaded. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Stick around for the epilogue, in which we explore the question of Israel, the tribe, as Merneptah describes them. Where exactly did they live, and how do they line up with the biblical narratives that are so famous today? We'll discuss that in just a moment. The History of Egypt podcast is generously supported by my patrons. In particular, I'd like to thank the priests, my top-tier supporters, who are much, much too kind. Special thanks to Chris, Erjan, Farran, Terry, Alicia, Andy and Chelsea, Nadine, Dan, Mallory, Suyon, Karen, C. Yin, Yola, Dan S., Carlos, Kate, Jeffrey, TJ, Veronica, James B., Andrew, Erin, Mykost, Eric, and Linda. Folks, thank you so much. May Baal, the Lord of Storms and Master of Ugarit, protect your household from any tremors, and ensure that you always have abundant supplies of grain and fish. I would also like to thank Sasha and Stephen, who recently joined as hereditary nobles and overseers, respectively. Folks, thank you very much. It is greatly appreciated. Now then, let's discuss a tribe called Israel. Merneptah's victory stealer claims that the, quote, Israel people are desolated, without its seed. Israel feket ben peret ef. To date, this is the earliest known reference to a people called Israel. But what does it mean? Who were they? Where and how were they living? And how closely does this group connect with the biblical stories? As you can imagine, this is a vast topic that multiple scholars have written entire books debating the nuances. For our story, though, we focus on Merneptah and the late 13th century. What can we glean from that context? Regarding the victory stealer, the text lays out a couple of clear points. Firstly, the scribe producing this inscription defined the Israel group differently from other Canaanite places. When referencing Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam, the scribe used a particular hieroglyph. The symbol is a 3-pronged cluster of hills, used in words like chasset, or foreign land. For Israel, however, the scribe used a different determinative, a man and a woman seated atop 3 vertical strokes, marking a plural. This is the hieroglyph cluster used for words like family, abet, and tribe, mehut. So from the text, it seems that Merneptah considered this Israel people a group rather than a region, a tribe rather than a kingdom. Okay, so they're not quite settled or sedentary. Where are they living? The victory stealer seems to present its locations in a south to north order, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yenoam. Israel comes after that, so in theory they should be north of Yenoam, perhaps in the Galilee region, or even further north. That is debated though. Scholars like Anson Rainey have proposed that the east bank of the Jordan River makes more sense. Others, like William Dever, argue for the west bank and the central Canaanite hills. And still others, like Israel Finkelstein and Daniel Kahn, suggest a desert fringe population slowly moving into the region. You would think that working from the same archaeological material, scholars might arrive at a general consensus. Not much to go on, is it? Finally, the big question. Is this Israel group the same one described in the Hebrew Bible, specifically the books of Exodus, Joshua, and Judges? Were they a single population on the move, perhaps fleeing Egypt, that invaded and settled Canaan? Here, archaeologists do actually have a consensus. Rather than a straight-up conquest, like the one described in Joshua, the earliest Israelites seem to have emerged from the local Canaanite population. Across excavations, the settlement patterns, architecture, artifacts, burial customs, and even traces of diet point to a group that developed within an existing culture rather than replacing it. The mechanisms and processes by which this happened are still debated, and there are competing models. And the more traditionalist historians, like Kenneth Kitchen, still retained that biblical view. But looking at the evidence from the land itself, archaeologists no longer follow the conquest model. In the late Bronze Age, the first Israelites appear to be Canaanites. Oddly enough, Merneptah's art seems to support that view. At Karnak, all Merneptah's enemies are stereotypical Canaanite and Bedouin, or Shasu. They wear the same costumes, have the same facial features, and fall before Pharaoh in the same manner. Apparently, the Egyptians saw no difference, culturally, between any of these groups, which gives the impression that this new tribe were locals rather than outsiders. We don't take that as gospel, so to speak. Egyptian art can be frightfully formulaic, and what did a conquering warlord care about minor differences in the subject populations? Still, considering how large Egypt looms in the Bible, it's interesting that pharaonic artists made no effort to identify this tribe. Bringing that all together, what have we learned? Merneptah's stela is the earliest definitive reference to Israel, but the text doesn't tell us much, only that a tribe with that name lived somewhere in Canaan. Based on archaeological material, they were probably Canaanites themselves, perhaps pastoralists or farmers. They may have lived in the southern and central highlands, or the northern valleys, and allegedly Merneptah defeated them and stole their grain. It's not much to go on, but for now, that is all we know. Needless to say, the reign of Merneptah in the late 13th century is just a small prelude to the story of this tribe. We'll see them again.